23 years earlier, in the spring of 1824, Thomas was born not in a bed, but on a pallet of straw in a cabin that smelled of earth and wood smoke. His mother, Sarah, was a field hand with hands as strong as knotted rope. His father was a man named Isaiah, sold south to a sugar plantation in Louisiana 6 months before Thomas drew his first breath. Sarah did not cry out during the labor. She had learned early that sound attracted unwanted attention. She bit down on a leather strap and brought her son into the world in near silence, broken only by her ragged breathing and the chirping of crickets outside. The overseer, a man named Virgil Hogg, noted the birth in his ledger the next morning with a single, indifferent line, Sarah, child born, male. To be called Thomas. He did not look at the infant. Property was recorded, not admired. Thomas's first memory was not of a face, but of a sensation, the relentless, searing heat of the Georgia sun on the back of his neck as he toddled behind his mother between the rows of cotton. His world was a narrow corridor defined by the high, white walls of the cotton plants, the hard-packed earth beneath his bare feet, and the looming silhouette of the big house on the hill. He learned the language of Willow Creek before he learned words. The crack of a distant whip was a warning, the ringing of the plantation bell meant movement, the particular cadence of Mistress Eleanor's footsteps on the upstairs floorboards meant she was pacing, which often preceded trouble. His childhood was a study in scarcity. His clothing was a rough linen shirt that hung to his knees. Supper was a bowl of boiled cowpeas and a piece of cornbread, if the cook was feeling generous. Hunger was a constant companion, a hollow ache he learned to ignore. But the greater scarcity was safety. At the age of 5, he witnessed his friend Josiah, a boy of 8, taken away in a trader's cart after his mother had died of fever. Josiah's thin wails echoed across the quarter until they were swallowed by the dust of the road. Thomas asked no questions. His mother's hand, squeezing his shoulder until it hurt, was answer enough. Willow Creek was not one of the mythic, monstrous plantations of the Deep South. It was, in its way, more insidious, a place of genteel horror, where cruelty wore a mask of civility. Master Alastair Devereux was a distracted man, more concerned with his political ambitions in Milledgeville and the price of cotton in Charleston than with the day-to-day operations of his home. His absence created a vacuum of power. It was filled by 2 people, his wife, Eleanor, and Virgil Hogg. Mistress Eleanor Devereux was a slender woman with hair the color of winter ash and eyes that missed nothing. She ran Willow Creek with a meticulous, chilly efficiency. She was not given to outbursts or theatrical cruelty. Her injustice was administrative, delivered in quiet tones and written in her household ledger. She ordered measured punishments, calculated reductions in rations, and approved sales with the same detached focus she applied to balancing accounts. She was a woman trapped in the cage of her own making, her face a porcelain mask that rarely cracked, though sometimes, in the deep night, Thomas, sleeping on the floor outside her bedroom door as a child servant, would hear the faint, muffled sound of weeping through the door. Then there was Virgil Hogg. Where Eleanor was cold precision, Hogg was hot, brutal chaos. A man with a neck thick as a fire log and breath that stank of cheap whiskey, he believed in the gospel of the lash. His cruelty was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. He took pleasure in the flinch, the stifled groan, the broken spirit. He viewed the enslaved not as humans, but as recalcitrant animals in need of constant breaking. Thomas's unique trait emerged in this environment, not as a blaze of defiance, but as a deep, still well of observation. He possessed a preternatural quietness. He could move through the big house like a shadow, his presence so unobtrusive that the white inhabitants would speak freely in front of him, forgetting he was there, or perhaps believing he was incapable of understanding. He listened. He remembered. He stored away names, dates, debts, secrets, and vulnerabilities. He learned the rhythm of Hogg's rages, the telltale signs that preceded a beating. He noted which of Eleanor's porcelain figurines was her favorite, which ledger contained the records of the secret loans Master Alastair had taken out, and which visiting preacher was secretly drinking the master's brandy. This silent watchfulness did not go unnoticed by Eleanor. When Thomas was 10, she brought him from the quarter to the house, nominally to serve as a footboy. In reality, she had seen his clear, intelligent eyes taking in everything. She wanted that watchfulness under her own roof, where she could control it. "You have quiet hands, Thomas," she said once, almost to herself, as he lit the lamps in the parlor. He said nothing, simply bowed his head. The compliment felt colder than any insult. Life in the big house was a different kind of field, with its own thorns and brambles. Thomas waited table, polished silver, and ran errands. He saw the opulence up close, the crystal decanters, the Brussels lace, the oil paintings of stern ancestors. He also saw the rot beneath the gilding. He witnessed Master Alistair backhand a maid for spilling claret. He heard the arguments between master and mistress, their hissed accusations about money, about absences, about the paternity of their own son, Charles, a spoiled, petulant boy who took delight in setting tripwires for Thomas and reporting imagined slights to his mother. Thomas's mother, Sarah, remained in the fields. Every Sunday afternoon, Thomas was permitted 1 hour with her. They sat on a stump at the edge of the woods, not touching, for affection displayed was vulnerability exposed. She would ask him what he had seen and heard. He would tell her in their coded language. Information was their only currency, their only defense. The slow burn tension of Willow Creek ignited when Thomas was 15. A prized breeding mare from Kentucky was found lame in its stable. Virgil Hogg, hungover and enraged, immediately blamed Old Ben, the groom known for his way with horses. No evidence was needed. Hogg dragged Ben to the whipping post. Thomas was ordered to hold the bucket of salt water. He stood frozen, the rough handle of the bucket biting into his palm. He saw Old Ben's resigned eyes. He saw Hogg's coiled whip. And he saw, from the upstairs window of the big house, the pale, observing face of Mistress Eleanor. The first crack of the lash tore the air. Thomas flinched, sloshing water over the rim. Each subsequent stroke was a horror. But worse than the violence was the sound, or lack thereof. Old Ben refused to cry out. His silence seemed to infuriate Hogg further, making the blows more savage. Thomas kept his eyes on the dirt, on a single and struggling over a pebble, constructing a world small enough to endure. Afterward, as Thomas applied the stinging salt water to Ben's ravaged back under Hogg's supervision, the overseer leaned close, his whiskey breath hot in Thomas's ear. "You see that, boy? That's what happens to defiance. You got a quiet way about you. You mind it don't turn into a proud way." That night, Thomas vomited behind the kitchen house. The act was silent, like everything else. The true turning point arrived with a fever. A wave of illness swept through the quarter and into the big house. Master Alistair, Charles, and several house servants fell violently ill. The local doctor bled them and pronounced it a dangerous ague. Virgil Hogg, terrified of sickness, retreated to his cottage with a bottle. Only Eleanor and Thomas, who seemed immune, remained on their feet. For 3 days and nights, the plantation descended into an eerie quiet, broken only by coughs and delirium. Eleanor moved from bedside to bedside, not with tenderness, but with a fierce, desperate determination to keep her world from collapsing. Thomas was her shadow, fetching water, boiling linens, and administering the doctor's remedies. On the third night, Charles's fever spiked. He began to rave, thrashing in his bed. Eleanor, her hair undone and her dress stained, held him down, her strength failing. "Thomas," she commanded, her voice stripped of its usual ice, raw with a fear he had never heard. He moved to the other side of the bed and placed his hands on the young master's shoulders. His touch, perhaps because it was calm and firm, seemed to still Charles's thrashing. For an hour, they held him thus, a silent tableau, the mistress and the slave, united in the battle against death. In that hour, the invisible wall between them thinned to a veil. Eleanor looked across the sweat-soaked bed at Thomas. She saw not a piece of property, but the steady, competent presence keeping her son, a son she often struggled to love, in this world. She saw the son of Sarah, who had never once raised his eyes in insolence, who carried the weight of the plantation on his young shoulders without complaint. When the fever broke near dawn, Charles fell into a deep sleep. Eleanor slumped into a chair, utterly spent. She looked at Thomas, who was wringing out a cloth in a basin. "You may go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to leave. "Thomas." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. The words were foreign in her mouth, rusty from disuse. He gave a slight nod and left the room. Nothing changed outwardly. The next week, life returned to its grim routine. Virgil Hogg resumed his patrols. Master Alastair complained of weakness. Charles, recovered, returned to his petty torments. But something had shifted in the foundation of Willow Creek. Eleanor began to ask for Thomas specifically for tasks that required discretion, carrying messages to town, organizing the library, even helping her review the plantation ledgers. She tested his mind, and found it sharp. She taught him, indirectly, through tasks that required reading numbers and basic letters. He learned by watching, by doing, by the silent osmosis of proximity to power. He became, in effect, the plantation's secret bookkeeper, understanding its financial fragility better than the master himself. Virgil Hogg sensed the shift. He saw the unspoken communication between the mistress and the slave, the way Thomas was gradually elevated from a footboy to a quasi-steward. It poisoned him with resentment. The boy's quiet dignity was a constant, living rebuke to Hogg's own brutishness. He began to watch Thomas like a hawk, waiting for the misstep that would justify destroying him. The crisis came 2 years later, in the fall of 1845. Master Alastair Devereux, drowning in debt from bad investments and the falling price of cotton, made a decision. He announced to Eleanor that he would be selling 10 head from the quarter to a trader headed for the Mississippi Valley. The list included Old Ben, 2 young mothers, and Thomas. Eleanor received the news in stony silence. That night, Thomas heard the argument through the study door. "He is not a field hand, Alastair. He is essential to the running of this house." Eleanor's voice was like cut glass. "He is an asset, and a valuable one. The trader has offered a premium for a healthy, intelligent male of his age. The matter is settled. You will not sell him." The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shouting. Thomas, pressed against the wall in the dark hallway, felt a cold terror seep into his bones. The road south was a death sentence. The next morning, Virgil Hogg could not conceal his triumph. He sought Thomas out at the woodpile. "Heard you're going to see some new country, boy," he sneered. "They work you proper down in them sugar fields. Break that quiet spirit of yours for good." Thomas continued splitting wood, his face a blank mask. But inside, a plan, cold and desperate, began to form. It was not an escape plan, the networks were uncertain, and leaving his mother was unthinkable. It was a plan of another kind. He had one asset, the secrets in his head. He knew of Alastair's secret debts to a disreputable Savannah merchant. He knew of a promissory note hidden in the strongbox that could ruin him. He had to get to Mistress Eleanor. He found his opportunity that afternoon, catching her alone in the garden. He spoke quickly, in a low murmur, looking at the ground as protocol demanded, but uttering sentences that betrayed a profound understanding of the plantation's ruinous finances. He named the merchant. He cited the amount of the secret debt. He did not threaten, he simply presented the information as a fact she should be aware of, as a loyal servant concerned for the estate. Eleanor stared at him, her face pale. She was not shocked by the debt, she was stunned by the source of the knowledge. This boy, this slave, had pieced together the full picture of their ruin from fragments of conversation and glimpsed documents. In that moment, she saw the true, grotesque absurdity of the system. The person with the clearest understanding of the value and vulnerability of Willow Creek was the one person legally considered to have no understanding at all. She said nothing. She turned and walked back to the house. 2 days later, Master Alastair announced a change of heart. The sale, he said with bad grace, would be postponed. Only Old Ben and one other would be sold. Thomas was removed from the list. Virgil Hogg's fury was a physical force. He could not touch Thomas directly, not after the mistress's obvious intervention, so he targeted the next best thing, Sarah. He trumped up charges of laziness, of broken tools. He ordered her to be whipped. Thomas was forced to watch, as he had watched Old Ben. This time, the silence was not his to keep. His mother, her face pressed against the post, locked eyes with him across the yard. In her gaze was a command more powerful than any overseer's shout: do not react. Survive. He obeyed. He stood motionless as the lash fell. He died a little with each stroke, but he stood. That night, as he tended his mother's wounds in their cabin, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. You got to be more than survival now, son, she whispered through cracked lips. What she see in you, you use it. Not for you. For all of us. The following years were a tense, silent war. Master Alistair died suddenly of a stroke in 1846. Charles, now a man, returned from his half-finished studies at university expecting to take the reins. He was a coarser version of his father, with none of the residual gentility and all of the entitlement. He clashed instantly with his mother over the management of Willow Creek, and he loathed Thomas, whom he correctly perceived as Eleanor's favorite instrument. Eleanor, now the undisputed mistress, made Thomas her de facto manager. Virgil Hogg was formally dismissed after an incident of excessive brutality even Charles found distasteful. The plantation, under Thomas's quiet, unacknowledged guidance, became marginally more efficient and less overtly brutal. He used his position to subtly shield the most vulnerable, to ease quotas where he could, to keep families together. He became the ghost in the machine, the unspoken authority. Charles raged and threatened, but Eleanor held the purse strings. Her relationship with her son deteriorated into a cold war. She saw in him the worst of his father and the weakness of her own line. She saw in Thomas, the son of Sarah, the child of the system, the only person who understood Willow Creek not as an inheritance, but as a living, breathing, suffering organism. She saw the only legacy that made any moral sense, a legacy of impossible contradiction. In the spring of 1847, Eleanor Devereux took to her bed. The doctor called it a slow decline of the spirits. She knew it was a final reckoning. She sent for Silas Morgan, the attorney. She gave her instructions with a clarity that brooked no argument. She signed the document with a steady hand. She asked to see Thomas one last time. He stood at the foot of her bed, the same man who had once slept on the floor outside her door. You know the accounts, she said, her voice thin but clear. You know the land. You know the people. He said nothing. It is a terrible burden I give you. It is also the only justice I can conceive. She looked at him, and for the first and last time, her mask was completely gone. He saw regret, despair, and a twisted, desperate form of restitution. Do better with it than we did. She died 2 days later. Final act, the revelation. The reading of the will in the sun-drenched study was an explosion in slow motion. Charles Devereux's face purpled with rage, then drained to a sickly white. He shouted, he cursed his mother's name, he accused Thomas of witchcraft and Silas Morgan of fraud. He vowed to challenge the will in every court in the land. Thomas received the news with that same profound stillness. He felt no joy, no triumph. Only the immense, crushing weight of the terrible burden. He was now the legal owner of Willow Creek Plantation. He owned the land he had worked, the big house he had served, and, in the eyes of the law of Georgia, he owned his mother, his friends, his own self. It was an untenable paradox. Freedom, in that moment, was more complex than a piece of paper. Charles made good on his threats. The legal battle that ensued was scandalous, protracted, and vicious. It dragged on for years, a source of fascinated horror in Georgia legal circles. A slave, a freedman by the terms of the will, inheriting a major plantation. It was an affront to the natural order. The courts were hostile. Yet, Silas Morgan, perhaps out of professional duty or a begrudging respect for Eleanor's last wish, fought doggedly. Thomas, during this time, did not move into the big house. He continued to live in the quarter. He ran the plantation with a focus on preparing its people not for a life of bondage under a new master, but for a life of freedom that was, as yet, a legal mirage. He used the plantation's resources to secretly fund literacy lessons, to gather information on escape routes north, to build a cache of supplies. The final court ruling, handed down in 1852, was a masterpiece of cruel compromise. It could not outright overturn the will without cause, but the social order could not tolerate its execution. The judgment declared that while Thomas was the legal beneficiary, he could not, as a Negro, hold title to the land or exercise control over white persons, the overseers, the attorneys, the creditors. The estate was placed in permanent receivership, its proceeds held in trust for the beneficiary's maintenance, a trust administered by white appointees. Effectively, Willow Creek was frozen, its assets slowly bled dry by legal fees and mismanagement. Charles, bankrupted by the fight, drifted away, a bitter ghost. Thomas was left with a phantom inheritance. He was legally free, but his fortune was a castle in the air. He was a man of property who could not touch his property. What did he do with his impossible legacy? He did the only thing he could. On a cold, clear night in the winter of 1853, Thomas, now a man of 29, led his mother Sarah and 18 other souls from Willow Creek Quarter into the woods. They followed a route he had meticulously planned, funded by the last of the secret funds he had managed to divert before the receivers took full control. They walked, they hid, they traveled by night. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge in their heads, knowledge of farming, of carpentry, of survival, paid for in blood and sorrow. They made it to the Ohio River, and across. Thomas never became a wealthy planter. He used the scant resources he had carried into freedom to buy a small farm in Indiana. He could read, write, and calculate. He raised a family. He never spoke of Willow Creek to his children. The story died with him in 1898, a quiet old man with watchful eyes and hands that still bore the scars of a boyhood spent holding a saltwater bucket. The will itself was buried in a dusty probate file, a bizarre footnote in the archives of a county courthouse. Willow Creek Plantation was sold off in parcels to pay debts, its lands absorbed by neighbors, its big house burned by Sherman's troops in 1864. The name Devereaux vanished from the region. The story was forgotten by history because it was a story the victors did not wish to tell, and the survivors did not dare to tell. It was a story of a woman who tried, at the final hour, to atone for a lifetime of complicity with a gesture of monumental, flawed justice. It was the story of a man who inherited not wealth, but the chance to break the chain, to turn the cursed soil of his bondage into the seed of his family's free future. His legacy was not an estate, but a line of free-born children who would never know the sound of a lash, or the cold gaze of a mistress, or the weight of a bill of sale. It was a quiet victory, stolen from the jaws of a grotesque and paradoxical defeat. It left no monuments, only the unmarked graves of those who endured, and the silent, enduring fact of a freedom won not by law, but by a long, careful, painful walk north, under a sky finally their own.